Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Ashley. I'm Ryan Helon. I'm Executive Vice President of Investment Funds at Rev1. I've been with the organization about 12 years. One of the fun things I get tapped to do every few months or so is I get to be Jay Leno and interview a guest. Today, I'm real excited to be here with Mike Triplett, who I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with probably, what is it, Mike, at least 7 or 8 years now?
Oh, it's been longer than that. Probably back to Battelle.
Yeah,
when
I
you were
think
Nationwide, maybe.
Oh my gosh, that's right. How could I forget the Ventura days and some of the early experiences that we'll get into today? So my pleasure. Welcome Mike Triplett to our founder's story. Mike, would you care to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Ryan. As Ryan said, Mike Triplett, co-founder of MyoNexus Therapeutics, which we sold to Sarepta. We'll talk a lot about that today. Since then, I've started 3 more biotechs in collaboration with colleagues. Armatus Biosciences, which is a clinical stage infectious disease company, then Armatus Bio, another genetic medicine company, and then Nucor Bio, a non-viral genetic medicine company. First 2 technologies are licensed from Nationwide Children's. The last is from Ohio State.
Yep. So that's going to be one of the challenges today. Mike has been involved with a number of really exciting things. Rev1's been really fortunate to be on a lot of those journeys with him. So we'll try to cover a lot of really interesting ground on Mike's journey as a founder and life science entrepreneur. So Mike, let's go back to the beginning. So you're a Buckeye, studied at Ohio State, but unlike a lot of Buckeyes, you took a very rigorous path, arguably one of the most rigorous paths academically at OSU, getting a PhD in chemical engineering. So talk a little bit about what led you to pursue that pathway. What was on your mind in terms of what you might do next with that?
Sure. So I have to go all the way back to my beginning growing up in East Liverpool, Ohio, over on the Ohio River. At the time, the steel industry was collapsing. And as a kid growing up watching sort of the world crumble around us, I set out on a journey to try to figure out why that was happening, how to prevent it from happening, me and my family and my communities. And that led me into the realm of innovation. I know some of us in the room are innovation junkies, Dr. Leiblein, others. Myself, I've studied it over the years. And that's what led me to it. And then combine that with the fact that I'm a first-generation college graduate. And the data show often the entry point for first-generation students into college, if they have a STEM orientation, even a manufacturing background, it's engineering. And for me, high school, I was good at chemistry, good at math, calculus, physics, and it all came together, chemical engineering, Ohio State, because it was the land grant, it was much more affordable, excellent engineering program. Had the opportunity to go to places like Case and other places and play baseball or football, but the economics just didn't make sense. And I was a Buckeye fan from the time I was 4 or 5 years old. Some of you know, my first interaction with the university was through the football program, not surprisingly, when we gathered around my uncle's farm in Lisbon, Ohio, and watched the Ohio State-Michigan game, and we won that year, fortunately.
But it's one thing to get an engineering degree. It's another thing to go on and get a doctorate in the discipline. What were you thinking in terms of what you would do with that? Were you thinking academia? Were you thinking you wanted to take that to industry?
Well, it was interesting. I was motivated to make money. I mean, at the time, it was just to be financially secure and independent coming from the background. So I actually went to Procter & Gamble after my undergrad and worked 2.5, 3 years at Procter. And I tell everybody that's where I really learned innovation. P&G is a phenomenal chemical company. People know them for their marketing prowess and their brands like Tide and Bounty et al. But P&G is really a chemical company like Bayer or Dow, DuPont, etc. But I learned how to build products that people would buy time and time again, how to do technology platform management, how to integrate financial management, how to and considerations, etc. But making diapers was not motivating as a 22, 23-year-old man. And I later learned the value after having two daughters of my own. But P&G had a pharmaceutical business, and I wanted to move into pharma because it was much more rewarding. And Procter told me, without an advanced degree, there's no way that they would let me do R&D. And I didn't want to do manufacturing. Coming from my background, I tried to move more to the front end of the innovation cycle. And that led me and my wife, whom I'd met at Ohio State, to come back to here, non-traditionally. And I earned my doctorate in chemical engineering. I did my research in lipid nanoparticles, which 20 years later, we are delivering the COVID vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna using that technology. And when I came back, I was a much worse student than when I left. I realized how the real world differed from that classroom environment. I was much more applied, much more practically oriented, participated in a business plan competition that Michael Camp at the time was running through Fisher at College of Business. And this is a long-winded answer. I was still debating though, did I want to go into the industry or did I want to go into academia? Where could I make the most impact? And universities were recruiting me, and I took one faculty interview to Carnegie Mellon and did my talk, did the 2-day event, and it was clear to me, and I grew up 38 miles from Pittsburgh, that it was a phenomenal institution, but too ethereal. I wanted to be applied. And ironically, and I thought when I made that decision, okay, here I go, I'm going off to the coast. Interested in life sciences, biotech. At the time, not much happening in Columbus, Ohio, but there was one early stage venture here, and that was Ventera Pharmaceuticals, which Patel had spun out and had raised 60 million or so into this respiratory delivery device technology, which ironically, they were using the same core technology that I had been researching to make the lipid nanoparticles. They were using the technology to deliver inhalation therapeutics into the lungs. And it turned out, made sense for me to go over to Watermark in Grandview where they were operating. And I was leading the formulation R&D and then later the pharmaceutical R&D at that time. It was my first experience in venture-backed innovation or venture-backed companies. And for me, it just sort of clicked because I think of early stage venture, early stage companies, it's really the libertarian view or libertarian experience of innovation. Same process that Battelle uses, same process that Procter uses, that Tesla uses, but the strategic context is different. How you compete for resources, how you show value is different, but the innovation process is the same, whether you're doing it at a big company or in an early stage company.
You know, that was a theme I wanted to dig into because you started at P&G, and then I'm interested to hear a little bit more about Ventera, freestanding venture that did raise capital independently, but spun out of Battelle. So kind of the influence of Battelle on at least the early days of Ventera and maybe kind of throughout that. So talk about big company, small company, innovation. How did those different experiences kind of inform and prepare you for, the entrepreneurial ventures that you would found and lead?
Yeah, great question. Again, because the process is the same. How you show value and compete for resources is different during the process. But learning what it looks like at Procter & Gamble when it's done the right way, or some of the clients that Battelle had, big pharma, big medical device companies, defense contractors, that what I learned at Procter and refined at Battelle was, I know what the end looks like. So under the premise or the theory of begin with the end in mind, I knew what a startup needs to look like at different points along the way. And you need to grow. Today's startup is tomorrow's Tesla. Today's Procter & Gamble, or today's startup is tomorrow's Procter & Gamble. They all started at some point, and I know what the end looks like. So being a chemical engineer, I'm a process-oriented person, and I don't want to over-constrain an early-stage company, but too many early-stage companies and entrepreneurs, in my opinion, are too undisciplined. And I think you need to instill discipline around your product development process and also your fiscal management. And as you know, capital is very expensive in the early-stage world, and you got to be incredibly capital efficient. Too many companies, too many entrepreneurs, in my opinion, they want to grow. I don't know if it's an ego thing, but you need to always be keeping your mind. I always want everything to be focused on building value. What's that KPI? What's the next thing that we need to hit to build value?
So you had the experience, at Ventera, but you weren't CEO. You were in, a product development role, as I recall, and you kind of got these ideas around what it would take to make a startup successful or maximize its chance of success. So coming from the Ventera experience and then looking at what you did in what one of my first deeper interactions with you on N8 Medical, coming in as COO, then becoming CEO, how did kind of what you learned along the way at that point kind of inform how you approached that first kind of senior leadership role and then becoming, CEO of that venture?
Well, we'll back up a little bit because first time CEO, I didn't know what I was doing in reality. When after Ventera, I was recruited into Battelle. I worked with people like Bill Dunleavy, Herb Bressler, Reed Hartman, and others, and increasingly moved into roles that looked like product management, strategy, working with the group on innovation, et cetera. So we interacted with a lot of early stage companies. And we had Battelle Ventures at the time. We did some of our own investing. And I thought I had a very theoretical understanding of what it took to build a company. But, and at the same time, there were discussions with leadership at Battelle and Battelle Ventures about me moving into Battelle Ventures 2.0. Battelle had a venture fund that was sizable. It never happened. The second fund never happened. But the proposal was that they would send me to the Kauffman Foundation to learn, to be a mentor, a fellow at the Kauffman Foundation, to learn the venture capital world and come back and be a partner in Battelle Ventures 2.0. I talked to a number of my venture capital mentors, friends over the years, and they all told me the same thing. Go lead a company or two, and you'll be a better investor one day because you don't know what you don't know. It seems easy when you look at it and you read a book or you're interacting with them, et cetera, supporting a fund like Battelle Ventures, due diligence, et cetera, et cetera. And they were right. It was in sports, you move to the next level, things move quickly. Things were moving quickly when I got into that role. And I made a series of mistakes, but quickly it starts to slow down, just like in athletics. And I started out as COO and then ultimately became CEO of the company. And it was a difficult proposition. What they were attempting to do at the time was to take novel therapeutics, novel compounds, I won't call them therapeutics, novel chemistry, apply them to medical devices to prevent hospital-acquired infections. Big problem, big market, big need. But it taught me the regulatory interaction. The FDA, because these compounds were coming off the devices, there was a drug risk profile. These are novel compounds that had never been approved by the FDA for therapeutic uses. Now we have a medical device, but now we're going to get regulated like a therapeutic. That's a very difficult investment thesis in the medical device space. So, two things we needed to do, in my opinion. We needed to figure out a therapeutics angle to the company, and we probably needed to go back and figure out if we could put these compounds on a way that they didn't come off devices. Try to avoid that. So we basically set up a separate division called Kinnear Pharma, where we pursued the therapeutic angle. And unfortunately, the compounds were too toxic to pursue cystic fibrosis type infections or other infections in a therapeutic use. And so the inventor who had done his postdoc at Ohio State was at BYU as a professor still there, Paul Savage. He went back to the lab and took 3 or 4 years and invented second generation compounds which are less toxic. And now they are being pursued for therapeutics today. N8 Medical figured out how to prevent the drugs from coming off the device. So now today, N8 Medical has, I think it's still emergency use authorization for a ventilator, so an endotracheal tube for use in markets around the world. So they figured it out. But I had recruited former Procter & Gamble pharmaceutical employees to build up a drug development team. Then we had to wind that down. And the other thing, so my passion was on the therapeutic side. So I approached the board and said, hey, your CTO should become CEO of N8 Medical. This group that I've recruited and built around, we're going to go off and we're going to try to form a therapeutics company.
So what happened next with that? And then bridge us to then what led you to start MyoNexus?
So Bruce Halpern and I started looking at different therapeutic technologies at the institutions around the region, focusing on Ohio State and Nationwide Children's. In parallel, I was doing consulting for the C-suite at Battelle, helping them on some strategic initiatives to keep the lights on while we were launching, and we were looking at various opportunities. So Bruce and I eventually zeroed in on two technologies, both out of Nationwide Children's Hospital. And we tried to incubate both in parallel, and we knew we'd have to make a decision at some point. And it's a good thing because an optionality. Anytime this is venture, you need optionality. That's portfolio theory. Funds have to operate this way. I try to do it personally to mitigate my risk as well. And the one compound, the one approach ultimately proved not to be ready for time. So we walked away from that. And then we decided Myonexus Therapeutics, or the gene therapies that Louise Rodino-Claypack and Jerry Mendel at Nationwide Children's and colleagues at Ohio State invented, were compelling and were venturable. So we formed Myonexus we took an option on the technology, I think, in 2016.
Myonexus was a really exciting and fairly quick success at the end of the day, particularly for a life science venture. So talk about the technology, the process of optioning, then licensing the technology, working with scientific inventors, and basically building a company. And I think this goes back to an earlier point you made, really thinking about what companies need to look like at each stage to attract capital, to really demonstrate the progress they're making, to the market, to other stakeholders. I'd like to maybe go deep on that, Mike.
Sure. The one thing Innate taught me, the one key lesson I really took away from Innate was the people really, really matter. You have to have the right chemistry, you have to have the right talent, but the right personalities around the room. In a large organization, those of us who have operated in large organizations, we know how to sort of maneuver people or minimize disruptive actors. That's not the case in an early stage company. So it became increasingly clear that from the get-go, and the scientific founder, the technical founder, may be the most important one to be able to have a good working relationship with. So Louise Rodino-Claypack, also first-generation college graduate from Scranton, Pennsylvania, or Northeastern Pennsylvania, Lehigh, I think, or King's College undergrad, Ohio State PhD. She had in my opinion at the time, really had limited interest in the commercial side. And it took me a long time to build a relationship with her where I think she trusted me. Today, I consider her one of my better friends. And her growth, not only did she become a co-founder in Myonexus, she is now the chief scientific officer of Sarepta Therapeutics, a publicly traded company. And she's built this research enterprise out at Easton. Her growth as a leader, as a commercially oriented leader, is phenomenal to me. And her story is the one that needs to be told time and time again to the faculty audience, in my opinion.
I think that early relationship development with the scientific founder, we see that as so critical. I think that, having observed that, what you did with Louise at Myonexus, you really exemplified how to do it well and how it could really pave the way, for success. But that could be a great foundation, but you had to go and take the Myonexus story, to the market, the seed capital market in Ohio, to raise that early funding. So talk about, that early fundraising and how you approached it and what you think helped you ultimately successfully raise that seed round that was so critical.
It's if you don't come from a sales background, asking people for money is not the easiest thing to do. So it takes a while to get comfortable with that. But when you believe in the mission and you're focused on the mission, you're focused on the limb-girdle muscular dystrophies. These are autosomal, most of them are autosomal recessive, or they're recessive, not autosomal, but they're recessive genetic defects. And it's a straight gene replacement. But most of these, particularly what are called the sarcoglycanopathies, the children, by the time they're 18 years old, usually in a wheelchair, like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which only affects males, the limb girdles affect both male and female. And often by 30, 40 years of age, they die from cardiorespiratory failure. So staying focused on what we are doing here to take this world-class science and give it the best shot possible in the clinic to prove that it works or not is extremely motivating. And in my case, I had a co-founder, Brian Barber, that Nationwide Children's had connected me with. So in the world of gene therapy, Brian, he lives in Kentfield, California, just north of San Francisco, up in wine country, around a lot of biotech folks at Ultragenics and BioMarin, et cetera. John Day, the head neurologist at Stanford, refers almost all of these kids out there to Nationwide Children's. So Brian was, because of our world-class stature in neuromuscular disease, particularly gene therapies and genetic medicines. So Brian, who is a serial entrepreneur, worked number one fortune list for one of his previous companies, brings his child to Jerry Mendel, is in a clinical trial here in one of the gene therapies. Brian and I hit it off, and Brian and a few others in the Valley put in some initial money. And then Rev1, Cincy Tech, all participated. And it was really, when it starts to come together, it comes together. But it's often finding that first node. And for me, I was passionate about it, but when you get the parents involved, who are also very sophisticated business people, Scott Fruing is a partner at a major law firm in Silicon Valley, former federal prosecutor. His two children also affected by a different form of limb girdle. He put money in. They provided the moral force for what we were doing. And it was the hardest thing was not to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
And part of that, I think that was interesting that I think you've done well across BioNexus and some of the other companies that you've more recently got involved with is figuring out the disease-focused foundations and the other stakeholders that really have this vested personal interest, aligning with them, building reputation, confidence, and then the financial support. Talk a little about how you thought about that connectivity to these communities of patients and how that was really instrumental as well.
It's helpful, as I already described, from a drive standpoint. There's no lack of motivation when the patient community is involved, but they are incredibly impactful in helping you raise capital because they are the closer many times with venture capital because venture's thinking about making money, but when the parents come in and tell their story, or the foundations come in and tell their story, it's really impactful and can really move people to get behind the company and the venture. The other area, and this is more inside baseball, but they are incredibly influential with the FDA. The FDA loves to hear from the patient community. And there are mechanisms where the FDA has lines of communication, often with companies, sometimes not with the companies, but the patient community can go inform the FDA about the need and talk about really getting into the weeds about endpoints. What are clinically meaningful endpoints from the patient perspective that goes into shaping the clinical trial design and therefore approval decisions. So the patients really become part of your development team.
So you were managing the relationship with the institution, the scientific founder, the engagement with patient communities, seed investors that, I'll say it, can be demanding in terms of expectations and communication. And then you're also building the industry connectivity, which really to segue to that, watershed moment for BioNexus, the transaction with Sarepta. So take us through how you developed, that relationship, because I think people see the headlines, but they don't really understand kind of the long-term development that you're building to culminate with something momentous like that.
Yeah, good question. So much of life is about relationships. So Sarepta, company that was formed on the West Coast, I know your partner Wayne Embry has history with Sarepta that dates back years at this point. Sarepta moved to Boston and pivoted the company into a genetic medicine company. They originally started as an infectious disease company on the West Coast. And one of their previous CEOs took an interest in gene therapy in the neuromuscular space, and they identified Columbus, Ohio, as a research leader. And for those who don't know, I'll say this time and time again, Columbus is on the Mount Rushmore of gene therapy. I would put UNC Chapel Hill up there with Jude Somolsky. I'd put Jim Wilson and the team over at Philadelphia on that, and probably Barry Byrne and a few others should receive consideration. But Sarepta in Boston identified Columbus as where they wanted to go shopping, and they developed a relationship with Jerry Mendel and Louise on the Duchenne muscular dystrophy program gene therapy, which is now approved as Elevidys, I believe is how they say it. And it's the first gene therapy approved for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It was approved last year. That entire innovation was essentially based here in Columbus, Ohio. It's a blockbuster, and they're not a year into the sales, and it's transforming an entire category of disease. Well, Louise was also working on limb-girdle muscular dystrophies. And so at the same time, Bruce and I are starting to build MyoNexus. Sarepta is always talking to Louise, and we're just hanging out, talking, comparing notes about gene therapy. And it turns out the head of corporate development, he was head of corporate development, Matt Gall, from Salina, Ohio, Bowling Green, undergrad, Chicago Booth MBA. And we had several points of commonality. We talk about Ohio State football, we talk about the Cincinnati Reds and everything else that's going on. And we just kept talking and building a relationship. And as their strategy started to emerge, they wanted to double down and go into gene therapy. After our seed round, we were looking for a $45 million Series A. And I was out talking to all of the leading biotech funds like RA Capital, Bain Capital, et cetera. And we were starting to line up this $45 million Series A investment. And Sarepta approached me and we engaged in a conversation about how we could be creative. Because they weren't quite ready to pull the trigger on these limb girdles, but they were moving in that direction. I think they were trying to figure out their overall strategy. So at the end of the day, instead of doing a $45 million Series A with the venture community, we did essentially an option agreement with Sarepta where they gave us the $45 million plus money on top of that. So $60 million for the option fee. I think it's all publicly disclosed. And we took $15 million and pushed it out to the shareholders. So 1 year into the company, everybody's into the black. We'd only raised $2.5 million at this point. So we're already a multiple on return at that point. And we used the $45 million left on the balance sheet to be as our operating capital, replacing our Series A. We had further negotiated with Sarepta that if we were delivering on the KPIs and hitting the milestones, they would replenish us the money we spent. So that 45 would almost hold steady. And then a year into it, we showed them the first three. It was a 2-year option. 1 year into the agreement, we showed them the first 3 patients from the clinical trial done here at Nationwide Children's. The protein expression was high, and the one thing about gene therapy is the translatability from the animal models to humans is incredibly high. Unlike other categories, cancer being probably the most famous, small molecule cancer. Sarepta said they'd seen enough. They were convinced it was going to work, and we did the transaction at that time. And over $200 million later, they bought the company, and now they have 300 people at Easton. They've built their R&D center of excellence here. It's a major win for us economically, not only the institutions, the shareholders, team, but I think the enduring value is going to be the economic development of what Sarepta is doing out at Easton. And most importantly, and this is in their guidance, and Doug Ingram, the CEO of Sarepta at JP Morgan, the healthcare conference last month in San Francisco, publicly disclosed that they are anticipating an approval for the first limb-girdle muscular dystrophy they bought from MyoNexus later this year. And that will be the most beneficial and impactful thing, is that now we will have participated in transforming a disease category.
No, It was excellent. And like I said, we were thrilled to be part of that journey. I remember when I was driving and got the call and learned about, the option agreement and the road it could take the company down. It was just incredibly exciting. It's interesting though, in hindsight, it all makes so much sense, but you and the board had a pretty big decision to make because, as you said, you were weighing kind of financing the venture independently versus this potentially very lucrative path with Sarepta. But in a way, I know one thing we're always cautious on, well, it's a trade-off. You're kind of hitching your wagon to this strategic. So what was going through your mind? What was some of the things you were weighing, and how did you ultimately get comfortable that Sarepta is the right partner? That's the pathway that you wanted to lead the company.
For me, it goes back to the people. I trusted the leadership team at Sarepta, and I trusted Louise, and I trusted Jerry Mindell. And Jerry's now since retired from Nationwide Children's, but he's a senior clinical advisor to Sarepta. In fact, I'm meeting with him next week on a separate topic. We're doing a fundraiser for Charcot-Marie-Tooth Research Foundation here in April in Columbus that I'm co-hosting with my wife, Nanette. And Jerry's going to come up from Charleston and be the keynote speaker and talk about the gene therapy journey and then why the Charcot-Marie-Tooths could be the next disease that Columbus, Ohio transforms the outcomes about. So for me, it was the people. Did I trust them? There are companies out there and people I don't trust. And I probably would have come to a different conclusion in that, but I trusted them. I know their drive. Jerry has been driven since I think he was a resident, and could not offer a mother any possibility of hope for her son who had just been diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And I remember one time he grabbed me by the coat in the lobby of Nationwide Children's and said, "Go raise the money." I'll say it that way, because we're gonna prove that these work.
Well, I think, to me, I love that you mentioned sort of the impact, after the acquisition, after Sarepta exercised the option, them really establishing this presence, which is one of what is now becoming a growing list of biotech and life science, economic development wins for Central Ohio, which I think is really powerful. And that kind of enhances the ecosystem, pays so many dividends in terms of the talent pool in our region, the attraction of investors and capital, which is crucial to your work and our work as investors at the seed stage. But one thing that was really, interesting, Mike, is you really didn't take much of a garden leave, after MyoNexus. You had other ideas, you had other projects. Maybe let's talk about Claramedics next and kind of your role in that venture, how you applied kind of the lessons of MyoNexus there, how that got started and where that one's at.
So many of you probably know Alex Fisher. Alex and I, friends from our time at Battelle. He moved on to Columbus Partnership. We were having coffee in his office the next day, a celebratory coffee, and he said, "Don't do anything for a year." And I completely failed that. And he reminds me of that all the time. So when he stepped down from the partnership, I told him, "Don't do anything for a year." And I think he's failed that as well. I'm just wired. It's hard for me. I'm just wired. If I can make an impact, I'm going to try to make an impact. So I was not thinking about infectious disease. Tim Robinson and the team at Nationwide Children's called me after MyoNexus and asked for my helping them reboot with Wayne here at Rev1, kind of locking arms to reboot this really compelling infectious disease technology, which I had known from my time back at Battelle. It's a bacterial biofilm. It's a really novel approach that Lauren Bakelitz and Steve Goodman at Nationwide Children's and colleagues over at Ohio State, particularly Nationwide Children's, have driven over the years, and it can be transformational, in my opinion, in how we treat chronic and recurrent infections, particularly in immunocompromised patient populations. And so looked at my team because we were out in the mindset we were going to go build another gene therapy company. We just came off a win. Let's go do another one. And there are plenty of assets here, not only here, but other places. And we now had a little bit of a brand within the gene therapy space. So let's strike while iron's hot. Well, again, I've known Lauren Bakelitz and Steve for years, particularly Lauren. She's also born and raised around Cleveland, undergrad Ohio State, PhD at Ohio State. Just stepped down as VP of Basic Research for Nationwide Children's Hospital, the Research Institute. World-renowned researcher, and has a history of working with big pharma and helping technologies move into the clinic. So Lauren and Steve, I trust. I like them. I respect their work, and the unmet need is significant. Sure, we can do this. And worked with the team at Rev1 and others, and we rebooted this technology. And this is all, then COVID hit. So then it was a little bit of a choppy for a while. But so I was founding CEO of Claramedics, but my job was build out the team, recruit the CEO, recruited Dave Richards to be CEO, first time CEO. I'm passionate about, we need to build the roster. We need to build more talent. There are things we can do within the university in particular to help build that, but we need people who just got to get the experience. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. I think Dave was in a better position than I was, but what I've done with Dave is I try to be his mentor / coach and friend, and he's just an outstanding person, but an outstanding leader as well. And he is building a team. It's phase 1/2A clinical trial underway in cystic fibrosis right now, and we should see data coming off sometime here, let's say by Q3 this year. So if that data is good, the second half of this year could be really fun for Claramedics. Either we'll be looking at probably a Series B, and I'm on the board of the company, so we'll be looking at a Series B probably this time next year, or maybe we can try to drive some partnering opportunities in parallel. I'm a big fan of parallel processing, just like we did with MyoNexus. So that's what we intend to do. And Dave has built a phenomenal team. And I'm most excited about the antibody, or not the antibody, but the vaccine that's coming behind the therapeutic antibody. I think the vaccine is a blockbuster in the making, and I think Big Pharma is starting to understand the potential impact that can have.
So it really highlights there's tremendous innovation, tremendous research, but that tech transfer, that commercialization, being able to get these assets in the right structure, with the right team, with the right plan, being so key into really realizing the potential. And as you said, developing a new leader to be able to execute that plan with support, being so critical. But you mentioned you were really interested in getting back into the gene therapy space. So you got Claramedics up and going, got new leadership in place, continue to play a role on the board, but then Armatus, new core. Tell us a little bit about those assets, how you really, again, built on what you learned and did with the limb-girdle muscular dystrophies, applying that to these new indications that Armatus and new core would go after.
Jerry Mandel he was chair of biology at Ohio State, then he moved over to Nationwide Children's, and he built the Center for Gene Therapy. Kevin Flanagan has now taken the leadership and is further enhancing that, and they are prolific. But what Jerry did, he basically recruited a team of scientists, and Jocelyn et al. Know this, and had them focus on a disease area. For Armatus, Scott Harper, the scientific founder of the technologies, along with a collaborator in Europe on one of the assets, he is an expert in engineered microRNAs. And I've learned more about biology. I know enough to be dangerous as an engineer. I leave the biology to the scientist. But Scott has learned how to vectorize microRNAs. And what we're doing at Armatus is we are knocking down toxic expression of genes. So in these autosomal dominant diseases, FSHD, CMT1A, they're the result of overexpression of the protein or a gene. So Scott has engineered these microRNAs to bring the expression back to the healthy levels. Whereas what we were doing before at MyoNexus with Louise, that's a gene replacement. It's the absence of the gene expression or the protein that causes the disease, and we just basically build it back up through Louise's approach. I think what we're doing at Armatus is next generation gene therapy, and much larger markets, and we're preclinical stage. Funding environment's difficult, so we're grinding our way through it. So it's the exact opposite of the MyoNexus days. We're on the other side of the biotech cycle, and this is just classic biotech cyclicality. And eventually, it's going to turn around. So we've been forced to be capital efficient here, more so than we've wanted to be. It's slowed our progress, but we're gonna keep grinding our way through it. And we've recruited an experienced CEO, Rachel Salzman, she's done a fantastic job building these programs out. They're locked and loaded. Now we just need the capital. We'll drive these into the clinic, and I think they have the potential to be significant opportunities, but really impactful within the disease category. In fact, last year, predicate example that we use for Armatus now, there's it's a similar but different technology, same stage, preclinical asset out of San Diego. Novartis bought the company for $800 million about 4 or 5 months ago, DTX Therapeutics, and we think a better approach to what they're doing, and they weren't that much further along than where we are today.
Well, and one piece too I want to hear you talk about is your original vision for Armatus, as I recall, was platform, neuromuscular, muscle wasting, variety of different therapeutic areas. And you concluded that, hey, maybe the best way to build and finance these is to have 2 separate platforms. So talk about how that evolved and how Nucor came about stemming from that.
So some of you may remember during the early days of COVID, the biotech markets exploded. And the venture capitalists who wanted to do, these are the big venture capital firms on the coast, who wanted to do the Series A and MyoNexus, were telling me and the team to, hey, go build a big company. Go get multiple assets. We want to put $100, $200 million into the company out of the gate. Look at Passage Bio, Taysha Therapeutics is another one down in Dallas, where they did this. And that was the guidance that the investors were giving us. We believe in the team, go get multiple assets. So from innovation theory, we build out multiple waves or horizons of innovation. We thought you could build basically a company around and sustain a company. And one of those was over the Horizon 3 type of opportunity is now what we call, it's Nucor Bio. We brought that technology in as a next generation delivery system for the virus delivery system, which is standard of the art today. And people want to get away from the viruses and move to non-viral delivery. And so we loaded it all up. And by the time we got the deal done with our partners over in Europe, the market had started to nosedive. In probably somewhere, May of 21, I think we got that deal done. And biotech peaked 5 years ago this month. And since the last 5 years, it's been the worst 5-year period in biotech in the history of biotech, particularly in the public markets. But it backs up and has really impacted the private markets, the venture capital market as well. So it was clear we were not going to get this thing financed at that level that the same people who were saying, hey, bring us this big package. They're like, we can't do that. We can't do that. We're sorry. We just can't do it. And for a whole host of reasons, as crossover funds or public positions collapsed, it impacts their private side. So they had less capacity to invest. They weren't just, they couldn't do it either, and the risk tolerance had completely moved to a very conservative position at that point. So we had to take a step back, put our strategy hats on, and say, what do we do? So we gave back some of the assets to the institutions we didn't think made sense, and then we kept Nucor, but we spun it out into a separate company now. So Armatus, we right-sized, spun Nucor out in a different company.
And now you've got Clarimedics, Armatus, Nucor, 3 ventures, all very exciting. We're involved with all of them with you, which we're really excited about. Your roles changed though, right? Starting these companies, you mentioned, recruiting CEOs. So how do you see your role today across those 3 ventures? And, what's really enabled you to transition your role to playing more of this board member, chairman, role, and then mentoring these CEOs as they took the baton from you?
It's definitely a process. I've had to learn how to step back and learn how to be a board member versus an operator. And from an engineering background, it's hard sometimes. You got to pull back, but you got to discipline yourself to do that. So I've learned how to do that. But the bigger picture, again, staying focused on the mission. What am I trying to accomplish moving forward? I'm partnering with many people in the room, Rev1 et al. I want to help build a sustainable biotech ecosystem in not only Columbus, but Ohio. So I've spent my time increasingly, I've sat on the Innovate Ohio Advisory Board for Lieutenant Governor, now Senator John Husted, along with people who are J.D. Vance, who's now Vice President, Vivek Ramaswamy et al. Have been on there, Mark Kwame, venture capitalists, et cetera. And thinking about what policies can we implement in the state of Ohio to drive more venture and innovation-based economic development. And then also engaged on the board of what's now Ohio Life Sciences Association. Natalie and Bill are here. And we needed a singular voice to represent the industry at the State House and beyond. And so I was board chair for the last 2 years, just rolled off, but I'm still involved. Helped recruit Eddie Pauline out of Ohio State to lead the organization, and have spent a lot of time there because it's impactful. And I know we're making progress because, we might talk about in a little bit, I've had interactions with some of our congressional delegation, federal delegation, in the past 3 days, based on some of the events in DC. So why? Ohio Life Sciences. And they know me and they know the organization. So when the organization speaks, I got the call. And so there's that. And then I'm partnering with the university, very close to people like Peter Muller. Peter and I are very good friends. Peter's executive vice president, head of the ERIC organization, Enterprise Research, Innovation and Knowledge, I believe is the actual title. Peter and I were together yesterday talking about, how do we partner? What can we do together to continue to drive and build a sustainable ecosystem? So to me now it's ecosystem building, it's systems building, putting the engineering hat back on, it's systems building. How do we build a sustainable system? Some of it's workforce, some of it's education, some of it's pre-K to 12th grade education. We need to prime the pump there. So that's what I'm thinking about. And then obviously, as we all know, we need more venture capital. We have to solve for the early stage capital. We have great seed funds. We collectively need to figure out a strategy for Series A in the state. We need to be able to lead Series A investments at the scale that biotech commands. The structural costs just drive a certain size of a Series A, and they're typically, at least within the biotech side of it, numbers really haven't changed for a decade, again, due to the structural costs. The typical Series A is $45 million in the industry. So we need, and lo and behold, that was MyoNexus' Series A that we had, and these are just bottoms-up budgeting to get where you need to get to build value. So that means ultimately we need what, $150 to $250 to $300 million fund that can drive these assets, and then be a credible partner to syndicate with the coastal funds. So we have to figure that out, and that's where I increasingly want to spend my time.
That's great, Mike. I think you taking some of the success and then using that as a springboard to show kind of leadership, public policy, building the industry, in Ohio has been, really key and impactful. So thank you for that as someone who's benefiting that from our work at Rev1, from that impact. It really is a challenging, one way to put it, time right now with, pressure on federal grant programs that really are so fundamental to that basic research that then is creating, these assets that can be commercialized. How are you thinking about that? Just the landscape at the federal level right now, the impact that could have, and how are you thinking about how Ohio, how our institutions, how life science founders can really, best navigate, the environment that we're operating in today?
Yeah, good question, and hence the interactions with the congressional delegation or the federal delegation. So let's talk about indirect rates. Everybody's favorite topic the last 3 or 4 days, 5 days, however long it's been, feels like 5 months. But at the 100,000 foot level, there are a lot of cross currents, but that indirect rate will definitely be a challenge. It's going to hurt. There's no doubt about it. And Ohio Life Sciences put out a statement to that effect. It's going to have a downward pressure or a headwind on the life sciences ecosystem in from ventures to commercialization, because it just backs up from the research. And the investments that Peter et al. At the university are hoping to make that would, I think, drive Scott Griffin in the back would drive more translational activity. So it's a challenge. If you dive into the issue, there's some legitimate there are legitimate points that are worthy of debate about how we arrive at that number and why. And I would argue our number is lower than the people on the coast that are trying to justify even higher numbers. That if I were in the delegation, I would be arguing they should be driving more money to Ohio and the Midwest. If you want a better deal, you want your money to go further, let's spend it where the cost structure is lower already. Because we're not at 80-90% indirects here, like some of the universities on the coast, for example. But I think there are points of discussion that I think the industry could have with the NIH about how we arrive at that number, but it can't be done overnight. It'll be hurtful. It'll really set us back for a period of time. Will we be resilient? Will we evolve? Will we adapt? Yes. But in the meantime, we'll lose some momentum.
Well, I mean, I want to kind of think about this from a position of opportunity, and there's a lot of different positive things happen in the environment right now. So, maybe thinking about, the Ohio ecosystem, Central Ohio ecosystem in particular, what are some things that you're most excited about, that are really creating some tailwind for growth and opportunity here for life sciences? And
well, our brand is elevating. Being out in San Francisco last month at the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference, almost every meeting I went into, people said, of course, Ohio. That's all we're hearing about is Ohio, Ohio. And then we were out there when the Andrel announcement came out, and they're like, of course, because this innovation, our innovation brand is elevating. Every time we win one of these projects or we have a success like Entrada spinning out of Ohio State and being one of the largest, if not the largest IPO in the biotech space in 2021, people in Boston, people in San Francisco, New York, they understand that. That was not the case 10 years ago. So one, we have a brand that we're developing and building. Two, our institutions, our innovators, our research institutions across the state, particularly here in Columbus. And to me, it's Ohio State, Nationwide Children's, and Battelle. People sleep on Battelle often. But all three are making investments. All three are aligning their enterprises to drive more translational work. That, to me, is exciting. And they're recruiting to that as well. So there's a mindset. It's a shift that we need to recruit some different people. Of course, basic research is critical, and we can't abandon that, and particularly a university. But we also have, I think, a mission, particularly a land grant, a duty, mission-oriented duty to drive translation and impact. And I think you're seeing that reflected in the leadership of the university, from Ted Carter all the way down.
So clearly there's some real exciting things to think about for folks building startups in general, life science opportunities maybe in particular in our region. I mean, as you reflect on kind of the last 20 years you've spent company building, taking a leadership role on the policy and ecosystem side, what are some reflections you have on what you've learned, what you wish you had known when you were getting started that would be useful to share with our audience today?
Yeah, good question. For me, I encourage everybody to the university, back to the educational environment. The university started this, I think it's the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Entrepreneurship minor. Was not there when I went there. I think that's a wonderful thing. The Integrated Business and Engineering program is outstanding. I wish we could expand that. Those students are incredibly talented. They have such a better understanding of not only technology, but the business and finance side. That we need more of that. And we need more experiences. I wish I had more experiences as an intern. I know we're building out, Rev1 does a great job with that. The university's talking about more in this space, getting the students, whether they're MBA or undergrads, into these startups early and learning and observing. I learned a ton at Venterra, just sort of observing the environment and the dynamics. I think that helps. And then I think learning to engage organizations like Rev1 earlier. You guys do a great job historically at helping to mentor, guide. Usually, and people when they first start out in this business, and Rev1 says no, they're like, well, they don't get it. You're out here. The investors are always, they just don't get it. I don't know what they're doing. Well, it's not them. It's look in the mirror, right? And so many times. But I'd encourage everybody to engage Rev1, Cincinnati, Cincy Tech, Jumpstart, et cetera, up in Cleveland, because whether you market it or not, there's an educational component to what you do for the ecosystem as well.
We appreciate that. And it's always great to be able to engage like this, engage with our founders that we've worked with through our mentor program. We're always trying to connect the folks that we're fortunate to work with to our new founders that we're working with. And we think that is arguably one of the most powerful things we can do is our work around connecting the ecosystem and helping founders develop and learn from folks that have done it and had success, not only in general, but here in our region, working with the resources that we have and so on. So Mike, I want to kind of wrap up my questions with thinking about legacy. You're a young guy, so this is a little bit silly, but you've accomplished quite a bit. You've got some really exciting companies you continue to really shepherd along. 10, 20 years from now, as you reflect, what do you want to really see in terms of the impact these companies are making, the impact, kind of the work that you've been so central to here, Central Ohio, has led to in terms of how life science looks in the region? I'd love to hear kind of your crystal ball. If things continue to play out with really good momentum and trajectory, what can that look like? What can we aspire to?
Yeah, we've hit some of this already, but I would say at the end of the day, 20 years from now, I'd like to say we'd have a roster of, there'd be a sign out here that has all of the drugs that have been approved and the medical devices that have been approved that are changing clinical outcomes, driving a certain amount of revenue. And then ideally we would have grown an Eli Lilly or Medtronic in this city so that we can build up a corporate giant in this town to help build out a different pillar of the economy. And then we have a vibrant, much more vibrant entrepreneurial and venture ecosystem where we have multiple funds with different theses that are investing across. So not all the pressure's on Rev1, not all of the pressure's on Drive Capital, that there's a diversity of capital out there that drives better outcomes. And then for me personally, coming from the background, Eastern Ohio that I come from, I want to see, and we talked about this a lot with the Innovate Ohio, I want to be able to see the benefits of the innovation economy that we've been building here, Cincinnati, Cleveland, extend out to whether it's Stark County, Columbiana County, et al. Right? It can't all be concentrated just in the 3 Cs, because that leads to, we see it on the national level, it leads to political instability. We have to do something about the imbalance that we have.
It's a great point. Just trying to grow the pie, growing the opportunity as broadly as we can, reaching out across the state. Well, I want to give our audience some time to ask some questions. So I think Ashley and our team will be around with microphones.
Hi, good morning. My name is Troy. Thank you, Ryan, for introducing what's going on the national stage, because that is my focus right now, particularly as it relates, because I'm a DEI resource specialist in the nonprofit community, and we're seeing a lot of our large-scale businesses really kind of acquiescing to the current administration in terms of the backlash against kind of DEI efforts. And I'm really interested to hear from our, startup entrepreneurs, small to mid businesses, we're even seeing Google. I did Google Maps yesterday, and they're now calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. So we're really seeing big businesses kind of kowtow to this. How do you, as a small to medium business, see yourself moving forward and navigating this terrain?
Yeah, good question. It's a very dynamic environment for sure, and I think early stage companies will largely they're almost, I'd say they just need to execute. They don't have the luxury to spent a lot of time thinking about it. I can tell you what I think, like the large organizations. It's a much larger issue for the large organizations. What I observe is it is definitely, there is no bias whatsoever in these early stage companies. They want the people who are going to work the hardest, the people that have the best ideas, that mesh with the team. It is on one level, one of the reasons it's almost free of politics, what I've seen. And that's one of the things that attracted me to it. It's almost like athletics to me. There's just not a lot of time to be out there thinking about some of this. Now, back in my previous employers, Battelle, University, Proctor, they do, and they have. So for me, you look around, and Ryan, you can speak to this. When I look at the venture community, the startup community in the area, it's incredibly diverse. Ethnically diverse, gender diversity, political diversity. I'd say it's probably more diverse than I mean, for me, I just see it's really about the best person to drive the opportunity. So I don't know, others, what you're seeing in the startup community?
Well, I think that the work at Rev1, we're really focused about opportunity and pipeline development and making sure that we're connected to our community as deeply and broadly as possible. So there is access to the resources here, the advice we can provide for founders, of all types. So we have some very intentional efforts around making sure we're connected across our community, building pipeline. We have some really nice statistics and growth of diverse founding teams in the companies that we're working with and funding. We're excited about that. We think that's just a sign of growth in the opportunity that we're one part of trying to broaden, in our communities. So, I'm hopeful that people just stay engaged, stay motivated. We're encouraging our teams to, build talent and be really, wide-ranging in their thinking about building the most talented, strongest team they can build. And we think diversity is important and a very important part of building the strongest team.
Thanks, Mike. Really insightful and I think valuable. I appreciated what you said about the technologies for MyoNexus being venturable. I also appreciated what you said about raising capital in Ohio versus talking about folks raising capital on the coast. Can you speak to if you've seen any differences in what makes for something being venturable at that earliest stage here in Ohio versus on the coast?
I think many times here in Ohio and the region, I think we fall in love with our own technologies, whether it's big organization, Battelle, or these faculty-driven ventures that we have, is that we don't do enough on the integrated business case early. We sometimes unmet need technology, but we don't. What I see often is we don't think about the other dimensions, the competitive landscape. How is the category evolving? What we're because it's going to take 5 to 10 years to get these therapeutics in particular to some point of 5, 10, 15 years, let's say, to get them approved. You need to be able to project where the science is moving, what's the competitive landscape, and you have to think about increasingly convergent technologies or technologies, AI, device technology, et cetera, that are coming in from an orthogonal position. So it's complicated. I don't think we do a good enough job on that robust, we used to call it at Battelle the conceptual business case, and continue to refine the full business case over time. We push technology too many times. Yeah, really, really good question. Everybody wants a biomarker. In venture capital, they want a biomarker. Pharmaceutical acquirers, the big pharma, they want a biomarker because for us, you don't want to have so in muscular dystrophy, limb-girdles, for example, it's a muscle biopsy. You don't want to have to go in and take a piece of muscle every time. You want to measure whether the therapeutic is working. So being able to have a biomarker like the protein expression that you can measure from the blood, for example. That is a far easier, from a cost standpoint, less invasive for the patient, less risk of complications. And if you do the preclinical work right, you can fast forward and predict the outcome of the functional, how quickly can you get up, how far can you walk, can you run, etc. Everybody's looking to shorten that timeline to getting the answer. So the biomarkers are absolutely critical in drug development.
Neil Johnson, more in the private equity as well as some innovation. Number one, hearing some more global funds that are finding Columbus as well and coming here. Can you touch on that? And then I do have a second quick fun question. So.
No, I think without a doubt, and Mike's been connected to some of this. I think capital attraction is very key for our success. And when you're building quality companies with excellent leadership, with incredible partners, you're putting Columbus on the map and attracting that capital. So I think there's been some really nice recent developments on the strategic side, on the disease-specific foundation side, with venture capital, starting to take notice and invest, in our Central Ohio life science companies and startups broadly. As Mike said, we have a ton more work to do in that way. And I think it really is that virtuous cycle, success begetting success. You get an investor to come and make their first investment in Ohio. They're coming here for board meetings. They're likely to be looking at deal flow, wanting to connect with additional companies and invest again. So that's the flywheel that is turning, and we want to turn it faster and more vigorously. Anything you'd add to that, Mike, in terms of capital attraction?
I would just say, in addition to some of the sovereign wealth or the foreign funds coming to Columbus or the state, we also have the big names from the coast that are taking notice as well. I've been brought into several conversations over the last 18 to 24 months with name your big Manhattan investors or West Coast investors that are, again, back to Intel, Anduril, all this real estate, all the Amgen and the other pharma companies that maybe we can attract. What's going on in Columbus? They're all coming here to figure out what is happening in Columbus, Ohio.
Second, a little fun, I guess, doing research on bioastronautics, space health, learning that Ohio State's actually a leader there. And ultimately, with the new space station going up, and I think doing a lab down here, selected with other likes of Palantir and the usual suspects. So seems like the ecosystem, but also within that, a lot of life science. You have really some of the activity going on, even with Shatner taking his DNA and putting it on the moon. So it's interesting at the airport seeing a big picture of him as hearing about things like that.
Two general related thoughts. One, space, low Earth orbit, huge opportunity, given the legacy in the state and the assets we have in the state with AFRL, for example, down in Dayton, Ohio State's strength in the space, Battelle, et cetera. Huge opportunity, which extends to the broader opportunity, which to me is defense tech. We're clearly in a militarization era, new technology, whether we like it or not. That's the macro trend. And again, we are incredibly well positioned as a state with the installations that we have from NASA to Air Force Research Lab, Battelle, Ohio State, and the entire aerospace supply chain that we have in the state. I think we need to lean into it.
I have one last question.
Hi, Dominic Carroll, undergraduate at Ohio State. I'm curious to hear on IP and licensing what your rubric is to sort of vet biopharma assets, especially with their early sort of preliminary in vitro data at that stage, sort of what your rubric is. And then if you could also touch on sort of the growing trend of a third of big pharma BD being conducted now via China and licensing IP over there for cheaper. That's a sort of a growing trend people are talking about right now. If you could touch on that.
So on the first point, it's a very complex rubric. I'd be happy to, I don't want to bore everybody here, But we have some pretty extensive spreadsheets to hit the different dimensions of pharmacology and toxicology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And be happy to walk you through that and offline. And then on China, they're a force, right? They've been building up in the biotech space for 20, 25 years. Several of my former PhD colleagues here went off to Pfizer, let's say, here in the US, and now they're over in China. So they've been trained here, they've learned how our companies operate, and they've moved back to China for various reasons. And they're very capable. So it's inevitable. And I think I gave a talk down at AFRL last year in biotech. And I was struck at some of the innovation data and where we are relative to China in some of the new areas, synthetic bio, for example, hypersonics, et cetera. They are a fierce competitor. They are like the Soviet Union was to us in the middle of the Cold War right now. And in many areas, we're behind. So I increasingly think places like Ohio State, Purdue, Georgia Tech, et cetera, we need to shift our focus into some of these areas.
All right. I think that's all the time we have. I just want to say thank you so much, Mike. I thought that was excellent. I hope everyone enjoyed that as much as I did. What a great conversation. Thanks again.